that's not something I'm going to get into. Thanks.
All right. To ask you about the MOU on semiconductors that India and US signed recently during the high-level visit of Secretary Raimondo, what will be the next steps in terms of operationalizing the MOU? What could be India's role in that collaboration?
I think the details of the MOU are still being worked out. As far as I'm concerned, we are close partners with India on secure trade, and that enables lots of different opportunity under the MOU.
Right. What are the building blocks that you would like to lay down as far as export controls go to allow for easier collaboration, easier export of semiconductor technology from US to India? What are the building blocks that you would like to identify and put in place?
Well, actually, as it stands now, we treat India, because it is a major defense partner, we treat India as if it were akin to a NATO partner. Under export controls, we have very strong building blocks already in place with India, and I look forward to future collaboration as we identify emerging technologies to build those blocks together.
Right. In terms of having a global acceptance for those export controls that US is imposing, is there a need for that? Is US trying to have a multilateral acceptance with more countries on board with these controls?
We are always looking for a multilateral approach to export controls. One of my colleagues once described unilateral controls as damming half the river. When there's foreign availability of technology, we must have multilateral cooperation with our partners to make sure that we are effective in the controls that we impose.
Right. My final set of questions. What are the issues that you would like to put on the table ahead of this dialogue when it comes to export controls to facilitate trade between the two countries in high-end technology?
One thing that's we've come to realize during our week in India is that we have some availability for smoother trade without license that doesn't seem to be fully taken advantage of by Indian companies. And so we'd like to do more education and outreach to Indian companies and to their U.S. exporters to make sure they understand that there may be smoother ways, faster, more effective and efficient ways to receive trade from the United States that isn't being used right now.
All right, so that was Thea Rosamund Kendler, the Assistant Secretary for Export Administration, talking about export controls to stop high-end chips from going to China and Russia. Let's open this up for our viewers. Let me go across to Paul, who's on our panel right now. Paul, thank you very much. Give us a sense of the larger aims of the U.S. export controls. We had the Assistant Secretary Kendler explaining that U.S. wants to deter China from getting that high-end technology, those advanced chips, which can be used in AI, military weapons as well. But is the U.S. really successful in doing so?
Well, we've seen that the U.S. and many countries are very deeply concerned about China's military buildup in the region. China's been threatening many surrounding countries, India, Taiwan, many others, and AI is an important enabler of Chinese military power. And so the U.S. controls are very targeted. They go after an estimated 1% of the chips that China is importing. But these most advanced chips are essential to control these to make sure that China is not leveraging this technology to improve its military and to threaten the region.
Right. Mr. Manocha, what's your sense? Is this really helping the U.S. industry, harming the U.S. industry, and impacting the global supply chains? What could be the long-term impact of such export controls?
Thank you, Mr. Luthra. In my opinion, the concerns that the U.S. has raised about the national security, I think we're not there to second guess them. I fully agree with their concerns and the actions they're taken. Is it helping the U.S. industry? Not yet. I mean, of course, there's a major export to these countries that we're talking about. But I think things will balance out as a function of time. I look at it this way. The industry is growing through leaps and bounds. I mean, our industry was $600 billion IC revenue last year, and it's going to go to $1 trillion by 2030. So there is a need for growth of this industry. And I see that USA-India collaboration will really help to create another hub for semiconductors. And there's a need for that.
Right. Jeff, if I could bring you in on the specific aspect that the Assistant Secretary had spoken about how Russia is able to circumvent the US export controls. They are being able to procure semiconductors, essential components necessary to make weapons from third countries. How is Russia doing that? How can the US act against those companies, those countries? Does it really have the wherewithal, or would it need multilateral consensus to really implement these export controls successfully and take action against countries which are supplying these semiconductors to Russia?
Thanks, Parikshit. Great question. I want to emphasize that with respect to smuggling these chips, some of them are extremely small, especially at the die size level. So you have to have a really fine net if you were hoping to capture all of these ships reaching the battlefield in Russia. However, the point you make about multilateralizing these controls is a really important one. In the imposition of the export controls that were announced in October of last year with respect to semiconductors, they're focused, as you and colleagues have pointed out, on advanced GPUs at the data center level, on China's capacity to focus on supercomputer development in the future, and of course on China's ability to manufacture advanced chips. And so for the United States to make an effective policy, the controls as they were announced were unilateral and extraterritorial. And the US secured a key win earlier this year in its ability to convince the Japanese and Dutch governments to join an agreement to limit semiconductor manufacturing equipment sales to China, to Russia, and to other geopolitical competitors and bad actors. And so with this development to allow the US to prevent, in conjunction with other global like-minded partners and allies, the sale of extreme ultraviolet lithography equipment, as well as the next step down to deep ultraviolet lithography immersion equipment to China and other actors. That's a clear win in terms of multilateralization. From my perspective, the next step will be, can the US bring other partners and allies on board that are like-minded to secure the supply chain in the other areas of chips that they've identified with respect to the export controls? That will be key.
All right, we're going to take a short break at this point, but don't go anywhere. Our extensive discussion with Paul, Jeff Bean, and Ajit Manocha continues on the other side. We'll be right back in a short while. Welcome back. You are watching Global Eye. We're discussing the geopolitics of semiconductors and what India and US can do together and what possibly Taiwan can do as well. We still have with us Ajit Manocha, President and CEO of Semiconductor Equipment and Materials, Paul Scharre, Vice President and Director of Studies at Center for New American Security, and Jeffrey Bean, Program Manager, Tech Policy at ORF America. Paul, if I could come with you, do you see certain points where the CHIPS Act and the semicon policy of India to promote semiconductor manufacturing can complement each other?
Oh, absolutely. The U.S. and India both have a shared interest in growing India's role in the semiconductor industry at a number of places, whether that's in fabrication, in making the chips, in design, in the advanced testing and packaging that comes to assemble the chips and put them together, and in the manufacturing of finished electronic devices, where right now China dominates the market supply chain for manufacturing these devices. And so a lot of electronics right now, they might be chips that are designed in the US, they're made in Taiwan, and then they're assembled in China. And China has an outsized role in the supply chains. And we've seen over the last couple of years how much that's a risk, how much being dependent on a country where you don't trust them, it's not clear if you have these vulnerabilities, how China might weaponize that. That's not in any of our countries' interests. So finding ways to work together to grow India's role in the semiconductor supply chain is vitally important, and it's certainly a priority for the United States.
Right. But Jeff, is it really worthwhile? Because the entire urgency around semiconductors came with COVID-19, when we suddenly realized that there was a surge in demand for electronics and we have fallen gravely short of semiconductors. But considering India does not have any ecosystem for semiconductors just yet, where can India complement United States plans for semiconductor manufacturing? And can India really play a big role in global manufacturing of semiconductors in the global value chain?
Thank you, Parikshit. I think from an outsider's perspective, as an analyst, on the industry side, the challenge is that India faces competition from around the world. Everyone has a CHIPS Act, it seems, in place, of course, Europe, Korea, the United States as well. But India does have some advantages, as Paul mentioned. First off, it's in U.S. government interest to ensure that there is resiliency and redundancy among like-minded partners and allies in the supply chain. In addition to that, it's worth noting that India has a significant advantage with respect to design talent. Most of the major fabless companies, that is, companies that design chips but don't manufacture them, have offices in India and Bangalore and other locations to facilitate and draw on the talent that exists with respect to chip design. It is true that if you're looking at the efforts of the India Semiconductor Mission in their effort to move India up the value chain, I think it's clear that the center and certain states are very serious this time around about trying to draw advanced manufacturing capability for semiconductors into India. But there are challenges, and just globally around the world, as private sector firms are the ones that take these decisions. It's a highly capitally intensive industry with billions of dollars required to set up a fab or a back-end facility. And these companies have to take hard decisions and look at, do you have stable electricity supplies? Is there access to clean water and redundancy in both of these areas? What does the taxation regime look like? What is the regulatory environment like? Are there clusters of universities training electrical engineers and material scientists, as well as other related companies? These things take a great deal of time to set up. So I think for India, the key is going to be to secure the first mover and try and establish one or two of these clusters. But it's a long process.
It's a long process. Ajit Manocha, coming to you, India and United States have signed a memorandum of understanding on semiconductors. During Gina Raimondo's recent visit, very little is known about how this will really work out. Do we know the nitty-gritties of this MOU?
Not really. We don't know the nitty-gritties, but I think the big picture is very clear. I think my colleagues Paul and Jeffrey have articulated the role India can play and India should play. And I think SEMI brings yet another dimension. SEMI is a 50-some years old India trade association where we bring the ecosystem into the countries who need to grow. And we enable the ecosystem. And I think my recent discussions with the government of India, especially with the Honorable Minister Ashwini Vaishnaw and Rajiv Chandrasekharji, we have outlined how SEMI can play a role to bring the ecosystem into India. Like we have various events held by SEMI in like-minded countries like Japan, South Korea, Europe, US, of course. And we are planning on bringing a similar kind of Semicon conference into India in 24. And that will actually bring the entire ecosystem for networking and for also supporting India's new projects. As Jeffrey mentioned, that we need to see the first a couple of new companies to come in, and we need to play a role to support them to make sure they are very successful and first time right. So I think that's the role where SEMI will play, and we'll make this a success. Whatever the MOU contents are, well, I think we're going to build upon that. And I think the Assistant Secretary said that the details are being worked out. And I'm pretty sure that in the coming weeks, we'll be involved in those planning discussions with Department of Commerce and the Indian government.
Right. I would also like to ask you, since the Indian government announced the Semicon policy, we've not seen too much really taking off the ground when it comes to actual work on the ground. Yes, a few companies have signed joint ventures, announced plans, but we've not really seen things moving as such as far as actual groundwork goes, Mr. Manocha. Do you think India needs to do more? Are investors right now a little wary, little hesitant about the India semiconductor story, Mr. Manocha?
Well, you know, I would say one thing, that in the past there were some missed opportunities where India announced the fabs and didn't happen. But I think this policy, for the first time, I feel this policy is very well thought of. It underpins the various comments and inputs I have been giving, and I think India has been receiving from other semiconductor veterans as well. I'm very pleased with the progress that's going on under the India Semiconductor Mission. I am under NDA, so I cannot really reveal any of the details, but the couple of applicants which we are in the final stages of reviewing, I think I am very pleased that the business plan looks very convincing and compelling. And again, the next question will be how to make it implemented. Of course, before that, Government of India has to do its own due diligence to make sure that they qualify in all other issues that they have to deal with, especially the recent news about some of the financial issues with some of the companies. So, but as far as business plan is concerned, I'm feeling very, very, very pleased with what I've seen so far. And the next question will be execution plan or implementation plan. Here we'll need a lot of involvement of the Government of India to make sure that we can bring the right kind of support from outside India to make it a success.
Right. Paul, coming back to you, Taiwan, I think a question that Taiwan is asking, what will be Taiwan's role when it comes to U.S. global alliances on semiconductors, including the alliance with India for that matter? Do you think, from your conversations, your understanding of the U.S. government, do they have a role for Taiwan? Will Taiwan have a role to play between U.S. and India when it comes to that MOU?
Well, Taiwan, I think, is under any scenario going to continue to be the leading hub of semiconductor manufacturing, particularly for the most leading edge chips. And that's not going to change. The lead that TSMC has over other companies is remarkable. Really, other than Samsung in Korea, there's really no other companies that are competing up at the leading edge. And so I don't think that's going to change. We've begun to see TSMC look to diversify some of its manufacturing. They're placing a close to leading edge fab in the United States. So that's, I think, an important consideration. And they are playing a very active role, both the company and the Taiwanese government, in working with other countries, United States, Japan, the Netherlands, others, including, I think there's a lot of opportunity for them to work with India as we think about diversifying supply chains, creating more resiliency. But I don't think there's any scenario in which Taiwan doesn't continue to be a really important focal point for leading edge semiconductor manufacturing in the future.
Right. Jeffrey, we've run out of time, but very briefly, can Taiwan play a role in helping India skill its workforce when it comes to semiconductor manufacturing?
Yeah, I agree with Paul. There's not going to be a scenario where Taiwan isn't at the forefront of the semiconductor ecosystem. With respect to the plans that India has put forward, I think there is a potential role for collaboration and training. Of course, my understanding is of the bids that have been publicly discussed, Vedanta, Foxconn. Of course, Foxconn is a Taiwanese and Chinese company, but doesn't have a great deal of semiconductor expertise. So the challenge will be, I think, for all of these bids, can they attract a leading semiconductor firm that has real expertise and know-how in manufacturing? On the training side, I think there are opportunities for collaboration between TechGrow and other entities within India on the island. And of course, Taiwan has all the things that we just discussed in terms of clustering effect, in terms of science parks and the know-how, the infrastructure in place. So that expertise is something that I think the government is willing to share with like-minded partners and allies.
All right, we've run out of time, but Jeffrey Bean, Paul Scharre, and Ajit Manocha, thank you very much for joining us here on Global Eye, giving us your view on India-U.S. Collaboration on semiconductors and U.S. attempts to form alliances on chips to really have strong supply chains. That's all we have time for on Global Eye. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.